Imagine a world where the sun dictates the end of the day. For thousands of years, when the sky went black, the world stopped. But in the late 19th century, a single company decided to challenge the rotation of the Earth itself. That company was General Electric. To walk into a General Electric factory in the early 1900s wasn't just walking into a workplace, it was walking into the birthplace of the future. While other factories were making shoes, fabric, or steel, General Electric was manufacturing something invisible, mysterious, and terrifyingly powerful: electricity. This was the house that Thomas Edison built, but it was the thousands of nameless workers who turned his flicking spark into a roaring industrial sun. At its peak, the General Electric Works, especially the legendary plant in Schenectady, New York, was a gargantuan sprawling empire of brick and iron. It was known simply as the Electric City. It was a place where the air hummed with a literal vibration, a constant 60-cycle buzz that you could feel in your teeth before you even passed through the gate. This wasn't just a factory, it was the ultimate laboratory of the American dream. Inside these walls, they weren't just assembling parts, they were taming lightning. They were building the massive turbines that would power the skyscrapers of Manhattan and the tiny, fragile bulbs that would sit on a child's bedside table in rural Kansas. For the people who worked here, General Electric was the big company. It was a place of immense pride and immense danger, where a single mistake could result in a blinding flash of arc light. But the rewards were worth it. To be a General Electric man or woman was to be a pioneer of the modern age. You weren't just making a product, you were ending the darkness. This is the story of the factory that plugged America into the wall. It's a story of how a massive industrial machine transformed our homes from cold, dim shelters into electrified palaces of convenience. But like every empire built on power, the story of General Electric is also a story of how the very world it created eventually grew too complex for the giant to control. Before General Electric could power America, it had to win a war. In the 1880s and 90s, the world was a battlefield for the War of Currents. On one side was Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, championing direct current. On the other were Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, pushing alternating current. It was a brutal, high-stakes fight that played out in the headlines and on the street. Edison's company was the foundation, but the merger in 1892 changed everything. The marriage between Edison General Electric and the Thomson-Houston Company created the General Electric we know today. The company realized that to survive, it had to move beyond the genius of a single inventor and become an industrial machine. They embraced alternating current power, and with that decision, the floodgates opened. The factory in Schenectady exploded in size. It became the Schenectady Works, a massive, 600-acre nervous system of brick cathedrals. This wasn't just a place of assembly, it was a place of raw, terrifying creation. Gigantic foundries poured molten iron for turbine housings that weighed as much as a locomotive. Machine shops used lathes so large that a man could stand inside the pieces he was turning. This was the era of the great turbines. General Electric wasn't just making light bulbs anymore. They were building the massive generators for Niagara Falls. They were proving that electricity could be transmitted hundreds of miles, not just blocks. The factory became a magnet for the world's most brilliant engineers and the toughest laborers. Immigrants from Italy, Poland, and Ireland flooded into the Mohawk Valley, trading their sweat for the chance to build the machines that would light the world. By the turn of the century, General Electric had established a pattern that would define it for 100 years: relentless innovation backed by massive scale. If Edison provided the spark, the Schenectady Works provided the muscle. They were no longer just a company. They were the architects of the 20th century, turning the mysterious force of electricity into a reliable, billable, and life-changing utility. In the early 1900s, General Electric did something that changed the corporate world forever. They decided that innovation shouldn't be an accident. They built the GE Research Laboratory, the first of its kind in America. It was quickly nicknamed the House of Magic. While the main factory floors were roaring with the sound of metal hitting metal, a few buildings away, there was a strange, scholarly silence. Here, men in lab coats like Charles Steinmetz, a 4-foot-tall mathematical genius known as the Wizard of Schenectady, were doing things that looked like sorcery to the average person. They weren't just fixing machines, they were discovering the laws of physics. Steinmetz and his team were the first to understand lightning. To protect the growing power grid, they actually built a lightning generator in the lab, a massive machine that could hurl man-made bolts across the room with a crack that sounded like a cannon. They were proving that if General Electric could create the power, they could also control its most violent impulses. But the House of Magic wasn't just about high-voltage drama. This was where the vacuum tube was perfected, the very heart of what would become radio and television. This was where Irving Langmuir worked on the chemistry that would make light bulbs last for thousands of hours instead of dozens. For the city of Schenectady, this meant a new kind of resident, the egghead. Thousands of scientists and PhDs moved to the area, creating a unique social mix where world-class physicists lived next door to the men who poured the molten iron. General Electric was no longer just a manufacturer, it was a patent machine. They were selling the future before the rest of the world even knew the future was possible. They were turning science into a product, ensuring that every time a person turned on a radio, looked at an X-ray, or eventually watched a TV, they were using a piece of the House of Magic. The factory was no longer just producing hardware, it was producing the very ideas that would define modern life.
That feeling of luxury you get when you realize your hair is beautiful can be yours at home with the professional General Electric portable hairdryer.
By the 1920s, General Electric realized that the real frontier wasn't just the power plant at the edge of town, it was the four walls of the American home. They had spent decades lighting the ceiling, now they wanted to fill the floor. This was the birth of the white goods era, a domestic revolution that would change the lives of women forever. The factories shifted gears. Alongside the massive turbines, new assembly lines began to churn out strange, gleaming white boxes. The most famous was the monitor-top refrigerator. With its distinctive circular compressor sitting on top like a crown, it was the first machine to move the Iceman out of the kitchen. It was loud, it was heavy, and it was expensive, but it was a miracle. For the first time in human history, food didn't have to spoil. But General Electric didn't stop at the fridge. They wanted to electrify every chore. The factory began producing the first practical electric ranges, washing machines that didn't require a hand crank, and vacuum cleaners that promised to suck up the dust of the old world. These weren't just appliances, they were liberation machines. They were sold to the public as tools that would give the American housewife her time back, transforming the home from a place of drudgery into a palace of convenience. To sell this vision, General Electric created the all-electric home exhibitions across the country. They weren't just selling a toaster or a mixer, they were selling a lifestyle. The factory became a powerhouse of consumer psychology. They understood that if they could put a GE clock on the wall, a GE radio in the parlor, and a GE stove in the kitchen, they didn't just own a customer. They owned the household's loyalty for life. For the workers in the plants, this meant a transition to high-volume precision. Making a turbine was a slow, massive craft. Making 1,000,000 toasters was a high-speed dance of stamped metal and heating coils. The Schenectady and Bridgeport plants became the pulse of the American consumer's appetite. General Electric was no longer a distant utility company. It was a member of the family, tucked into every corner of the house, humming quietly in the background of the American dream. When the world caught fire in the 1940s, the assembly lines that were churning out refrigerators and toasters didn't just stop, they mutated. General Electric became one of the most vital pillars of the arsenal of democracy. The transition was almost overnight. One day, workers were calibrating thermostats for stoves. The next, they were machining the delicate gears of torpedo gyroscopes. The scale of General Electric's wartime effort was staggering. They were everywhere. If a machine moved, shot, or flew in World War II, there was a high probability it had a General Electric heart. The Schenectady plant became a fortress of secrecy, guarded by armed soldiers. Inside, they were building the massive propulsion systems for the U.S. Navy's destroyers and aircraft carriers. They were the ones who figured out how to make a ship move faster and further on less fuel, a feat of engineering that tipped the scales in the Pacific. But the real secret was happening in the sky. While the public knew General Electric for light bulbs, the military knew them for the turbo-supercharger, a device that allowed Allied bombers to fly at high altitudes, far above the reach of enemy anti-aircraft fire. And then there was the Hush Hush project, the jet engine. In a top-secret facility in Lynn, Massachusetts, General Electric engineers worked frantically to perfect the IA, the first American jet engine. They were literally inventing the future of aviation while the bombs were still falling. The human cost was immense. The factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. With millions of men overseas, a new army marched into the GE works. The women. Rosie the Riveter was very real at General Electric. These women handled high-voltage testing, heavy welding, and precision assembly with a skill that changed the American workforce forever. By the end of the war, General Electric had produced billions of dollars worth of equipment. They had proven that their house of magic could be a house of might. But as the guns fell silent, the company faced a new challenge: how to turn a world built for war back into a world built for the living. The giant was about to enter its most prosperous and most complicated era yet. After the war, General Electric didn't just return to business as usual, it became the architect of the suburban dream. This was the era of progress is our most important product, a slogan that echoed through every television set in the country. And the man delivering that message was none other than Ronald Reagan. As the host of General Electric Theater, Reagan visited the plants and the homes of workers, convinced America that a better life was just one GE appliance away. The factories were at their absolute zenith. In Louisville, Kentucky, General Electric built Appliance Park, a facility so massive it had its own zip code and a literal army of workers churning out all-electric kitchens in pastel colors. Pink, turquoise, and canary yellow refrigerators rolled off the lines like candy. The message was clear. The grime of the war was over, and the future was bright, clean, and effortless. But beneath the colorful surface of the suburban kitchen, General Electric was playing a much bigger game. They were diving headfirst into the most powerful force known to man, the atom. At the Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory in Schenectady, GE engineers were designing the nuclear reactors that would power the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus. They believed that nuclear energy would soon make electricity too cheap to meter. The GE Works became a symbol of middle-class stability. To have a job at General Electric in the 50s was to have made it. You had the pension, the health care, and the summer company picnic. The factory was the center of the social universe. In towns like Schenectady, Pittsfield, and Lynn, the local economy didn't just depend on General Electric. It was General Electric. However, this absolute dominance created a sense of invincibility. The company grew into a massive bureaucracy, a private government of sorts. While they were building nuclear cores and color TVs, they were also becoming slower and more rigid. They were so focused on the glow of the atomic age that they didn't see the shadows beginning to form on the horizon, the shadows of global competition and the high price of corporate hubris. By the late 1970s, the golden glow of the atomic age had faded into the gray reality of a stagnant economy. General Electric, the sprawling giant that made everything from toaster ovens to nuclear subs, had become slow, bloated, and vulnerable. The private government was failing. Then, in 1981, a man named Jack Welch took the helm, and he didn't just change the company. He was a chemical engineer by trade, but his real talent was a cold, mathematical ruthlessness. He earned the nickname Neutron Jack, a reference to the neutron bomb, which kills the people but leaves the buildings standing. His philosophy was simple and brutal. Every General Electric business had to be number one or number two in its global market. If it wasn't, it was fixed, sold, or closed. The works changed forever. The paternalism of the past was stripped away in favor of shareholder value. Welch looked at the massive brick factories in Schenectady and Erie and saw overhead, not heritage. He began a massive campaign of downsizing and outsourcing. In his first few years, he cut over 100,000 jobs. The social contract, the promise of a job for life in exchange for loyalty, was torn up and thrown into the furnace. But while the factories were shrinking, the balance sheet was exploding. Welch pivoted the company toward GE Capital. General Electric wasn't just a manufacturing company anymore. It was becoming a massive, unregulated bank that happened to have a few factories attached to it. The profit no longer came primarily from the sweat of the assembly line, but from the complex movement of money, leasing, and insurance. Inside the remaining plants, the culture shifted to Six Sigma, a rigorous, almost religious devotion to defect-free manufacturing. It made the products better, but it made the work feel like a cold, algorithmic race. General Electric became the most valuable company in the world, a darling of Wall Street, but in the towns that built the company, the pride was being replaced by fear. The factory was no longer a community, it was a business unit. And as the 20th century drew to a close, General Electric was a lean, mean, profit-making machine, but it had lost the very soul that Thomas Edison had given it. For 2 decades, General Electric looked like a miracle. Its stock price was a mountain that only went up, and its leaders were treated like gods of the new economy. But under the surface, the giant had a hidden sickness. By the mid-2000s, General Electric had become a shadow bank disguised as a factory. GE Capital, the financial arm that Jack Welch built, was now providing more than half of the company's profits. The company that once tamed lightning was now addicted to high-risk debt. In 2008, the world's financial circuits blew a fuse. When the housing market collapsed and the global credit markets froze, GE Capital found itself standing in the middle of a lightning storm without a rod. Suddenly, the most valuable company in the world couldn't fund its own daily operations. The industrial heart of the company, the turbines, the jet engines, the light bulbs, was still beating, but the financial brain was in total cardiac arrest. The fall was swift and brutal. To save the company from total annihilation, General Electric had to take a massive lifeline from Warren Buffett and emergency backing from the U.S. government. The icon of American stability was officially on life support. The AAA credit rating, the badge of honor the company had held for decades, was stripped away. The aftermath inside the factories was a landscape of desperation. To pay off the massive debts of the financial side, the industrial side had to be cannibalized. Iconic divisions were put on the auction block. The appliance business, the very machines that had defined the American kitchen for a century, was sold to a Chinese conglomerate. The light bulb division, the literal spark that started the company in Edison's lab, was cast off. Schenectady, once the Electric City, watched in shock as the company headquarters was moved to Boston, searching for a tech-savvy image that it could no longer honestly claim. The giant wasn't just leaning anymore, it was fragmenting. The business units that Jack Welch had polished into profit machines were now being sold just to keep the lights on. The factory that powered American homes was now struggling to find its own way in the dark. The factory that once powered American homes eventually became a house divided. For over a century, the name General Electric was a monolithic shield that covered everything from the depths of the ocean to the edge of the atmosphere. But by the 2020s, the weight of that history had become too heavy to carry. The era of the everything company was over. In a move that shocked the industrial world, General Electric announced its final act: a total, three-way split. The giant was dismantled not by an enemy, but by its own architects. On April 2, 2024, the original GE ceased to exist as a conglomerate. In its place, three independent, focused titans were born, each carrying a different piece of Edison's soul. First, there is GE Healthcare, taking the legacy of the X-ray and the House of Magic into a new era of AI-driven medicine. Then, GE Vernova, a company dedicated to the energy transition, carrying the weight of the massive turbines and wind farms needed to save the planet. And finally, GE Aerospace, the guardian of the original GE ticker symbol, focused solely on the jet engines that keep the global sky moving. Today, if you walk through the old Electric City in Schenectady, you won't find a dying ghost town. Instead, you'll find a landscape of specialized resilience. The massive brick walls are still there, but they serve new masters. The pride has returned, but it's different now. It's narrower, sharper, and more focused. The company learned a hard lesson. That power is not just about size, but about the ability to adapt. General Electric didn't just end, it multiplied. Proved that sometimes you have to break a machine to make it work again. The light bulb that Edison lit in 1878 hasn't gone out, it has simply been passed to three different hands. As we look at the skyline today, we see a world that GE built, a world where the electricity still hums, the planes still roar, and the scanners still click. The name General Electric has become a memory, but its energy is still the very pulse of modern civilization. The Titan has fallen, but in its wake, the future has been plugged in.